All right, so we have skirted around the body of Hebrews 6 for the last couple of weeks now. And if you were here last week or even the week before, then you'll remember that the author of Hebrews has been dealing with some kind of weighty issues. All right, and I think it's important that we bring up again in review and to get people up to speed the historical context of this book. All right, because the author is going to continue on this, in the same vein of the discussion that he's been in, that, Christianity is primarily a Jewish thing. Jesus is a Jewish Messiah, fulfilling Jewish prophecies to a Jewish people. All right, he had Jewish disciples, and the first generation of Christians were almost exclusively Jewish. All right, and these people that were following Christ didn't really recognize any difference between being a Jew and recognizing Jesus Christ as their Messiah. All right, so they would meet together, they would study their Bible, which was the Old Testament, and the apostles were leading these groups, and they're talking about how Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecies. He's the Messiah that they've been planning for and waiting for a long time. And it's his death on the cross that God planned. And it wasn't some tragedy or freak accident or anything like that. It was part of God's plan all along. And Jesus, having gone to the cross, has finally and permanently dealt with the problem of sin, as he died the death that we deserve. And now that that's done and Christ has been resurrected to prove that the payment of sin was accepted, there's no longer any need to carry on with these ceremonial Jewish things. And so you have this group of Jewish Christians that are getting together, they're studying together, and if the book of Acts is any indication, some remarkable things were happening in the church. All right, there were miracles happening to attest to the truth of what the apostles were saying. And through the earliest phase, this, first phase of the church, everything seems to be going pretty good. But then the road starts to get a little bit bumpy because this little Jesus community is not doing some of the things that their Jewish brethren expect them to do, like going to the temple and offering up some sacrifice. And so they've stopped doing these things because those are the things that have been taken care of in what Jesus did. And as a result of them acting less Jewish, the mainstream Jewish community had a reaction against this little group of Jews that believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And the reaction was sort of, swift and severe. And quite a few of the early church leaders were basically taken out and killed by the Jewish religious establishment. So James and Stephen and others were eliminated because of the offense that these guys brought to official Judaism. So some real problems have begun to emerge, and Christians are being thrown out of synagogue, and they're being severed from their families in some cases. They were having their property seized, and there were all kinds of real consequences that these people were dealing with because they had stood firm in the belief that Jesus is the Messiah, and that they don't need another priest, and they don't need another sacrifice. All right, so that was the message that was being taught, and it was becoming increasingly unpopular among the Jewish community. All right, so the Christians were paying a heavy price for this testimony. And it's under that context that we talked about last week about some people that had sort of defected. The author says that they had fallen away. They were drifting back to Judaism. And they'd been drawn into this little community that was doing life together of Christians, but only to a certain point, really. Okay, and as soon as it became personally costly, they were headed back the other way. So those are the people that we talked about last week. But in verse 9, chapter 6, the author changes gears in a significant way to talk about the other Christ followers that had responded in a different way. Okay, and he says, "But, beloved, we are convinced of better things concerning you and things that accompany salvation, though we are speaking in this way." So remember that in the previous paragraph, the author has issued like a really solemn warning to believe and not to fall away. And he's been talking to these people that are on the fringe of belief, like we talked about last week. But this little word matters a little bit, all right? And so what follows this word is a but clause. The author is changing directions. That's what that means. And a big part of this change in directions is this clear change of audience. All right? Beloved, he calls these people. And that's in contrast to the kinds of people that the author talked about last week and the kind of people that Jesus talks about in Matthew 13. So this is verse 20 and 21. This is part of a parable that Jesus told. And he said that the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. All right, so this is like so many of the people that had followed Jesus. They had seen him do these amazing things, and they had heard him say all of these amazing things, and they're riveted to him. And then, the real bottom line comes out, that Jesus had come to die on the cross, and the crowds start to fade away. Okay, so that's the kind of people that he's talking about here. This is like a pseudo-believer. A believer, someone who says and thinks they're a believer, but it's not really a true believer. And the way that we talked about this last week was to say that this is one who has tasted and experienced the life of the community and the good things of the Word of God, but is not really willing to appropriate this belief in a life-changing way. All right, so Jesus is saying not to be that kind of person here. So real faith is faith that will take you all the way to the end. And it's these people of real faith that the author calls beloved. And that's who he directs the rest of this chapter to. And what about the beloved here? See, these folks have some problems in front of them. And there are certain things that are simply not options for them. All right, they're taking some real flack. People are being killed. All right, they're being dispossessed. And if this was happening today, what would we say? What would we do? Okay, we would be demanding our rights, right? So we organize into little groups and demand our rights over much less than this most of the time. But these people weren't, most of them, Roman citizens, okay? They didn't really have much in the way of rights. It wasn't really an option for them, and it also wasn't an option for these people to alter the message very much. So some of them were trying to, okay? They were trying to be into Jesus and still go down and do their thing at the temple. But that's what this author of Hebrews has been like deliberately driving in a wedge on that issue. He has said that it's one way or the other. There is no coming before God on the basis of your religious works and accepting the death of Christ as your substitute. And so a lot of this problem would have just gone away if they could keep their mouths shut. Okay, they could sort of just be Christian on the inside without talking and making a big deal out of it. But that really wasn't part of what it meant to be a part of this group. Okay, and it was actually a very cool dynamic that they had going on. And so everything that they had been taught about the Bible has sort of come together and gelled into this coherent package that made sense. And it made like life-changing sense to them. And they're all of a sudden welcome in the presence of God without having to do anything additional. All right. And so like just try to get them to be quiet about that. All right. They were very vocal about their faith, and they didn't really back down for much. It wasn't really an option for them to wait until the persecution went away either. All right, and then they would follow Christ. Wouldn't really work, all right? Instead, they were told to just kind of hang in there. And the author says that he is convinced of better things concerning you. All right, there is something really cool and really important and really valuable. And it is so life-changing and significant in this message that these people are sharing with their Jewish friends. And if they back off of it because of pressure, then they're robbed of this special thing itself. Okay, so in the middle of this horrible context, the author says that there are better things concerning you. And what are the better things that the author is talking about? All right, so we're going to jump to the punchline in this chapter, and then we're going to work our way back. This is verse 19 of Hebrews 6, and this is the better thing that we have to look forward to if we can persevere with Christ in bad conditions. He says, "This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." So what's he talking about? All right, what's the point that he's talking about here? And the point is that we have a hope that can endure anything. And a hope that he says that we can have as an anchor of the soul. It's pretty rich imagery, I think, there. A hope is what the soul requires. And so our bodies have certain needs, right? We get hungry, we get thirsty, we get cold, whatever. All right, there are many things that our bodies require of us, and we're fairly well acquainted with most of those things, I think. But there are also things that the soul requires. And so in biblical terminology, when we talk about the soul, we're talking about like the spiritual dimension of human nature that's unique to humanity. All right, of all God's creations on earth, the soul is the part that, makes us human. And also there's our psychological lives and our emotional lives that are kind of rolled up into this thing that we call a soul. And according to the Bible, the soul has needs that are just as real as our physical needs. And the author here is saying that central to what the soul requires is hope. And he says that hope is the anchor for our souls. And again, I think the imagery is significant. And so the author, considering their location, the author likely has in mind like a boat at harbor on the Mediterranean Sea or whatever. And so there's the waves, the tides, the storms, there's all this stuff that's trying to push the boat around. And what would happen if the boat didn't have an anchor? All right, it would be like certainly moved around a lot and eventually destroyed. And so also human lives that are not properly anchored with hope share the same kind of fate. They're quickly thrashed about and they're at real risk for destruction. So that's what he's getting at here. And so life apart from God in a pretty fundamental way is a life without hope. It's pretty easy, I think, in our day with all of the distractions that we surround ourselves with to get wrapped up in living in the right now, to mostly concern ourselves with money or jobs or crabgrass-free lawns or whatever it is, all right? But we need to spend some time thinking about the management of our eternal souls, the health and the well-being of the part of us that lasts forever. Okay, and so what if there isn't a God in the equation? What if this is all that there is? What does that mean for our lives? Well, it means that, we all do whatever we do, and at a certain point, the plug gets pulled, and I'm not going to have any memory of my life. I'm going to be unable to hold on to the things that I once treasured. All right, it's all gone. And the last that I heard, the mortality rate for human beings is right at 100%. All right, that's part of what it means to have a soul. We get to know that at some point, this stage of the game is going to end. And so I actually quite enjoy reading atheist thinkers and philosophers. Some of them are really quite capable of telling it like it is. All right. And so, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, the French writer Jean-Paul Sartre wrote an essay called The Wall. All right. I like it. And the story is that these three guys that are part of the Spanish Revolution are put into a dungeon, and they're told that in the morning they're going to be executed by firing squad. And so they stay up all night just sort of musing and talking about what their lives have been about in light of the fact that they know that in a few hours their lives are going to be over. And so it's kind of a great uplifting read. But one of the characters is sort of fortuitously allowed to go free unexpectedly, and he's reflecting on his escaping of the firing squad, and he says, several hours or several years is all the same when you've lost the illusion of being eternal. We live without any real serious consideration of what happens when this is all over. And that's a confrontational kind of thought, because it leaves us vulnerable to the idea that maybe we don't have all the answers. And in our culture, we just sort of fill that problem with stuff or being busy. And, so if we can feel pretty good about right now, then we don't really need to worry about eternity very much. And this thought from Sartre is saying that you can lose the illusion and live like eternity matters. All right. And of course, Sartre didn't believe in eternity, and that's not what he meant to say, but that is what he said. Life without God is a life without hope. It's a life without an anchor. And there are implications to that. All right, because without an anchor to the future, there's nothing to hold you in the present. And so do you understand how what happens in eternity has implications in my life here and now? Has important implications. And, we here in this room are basically educated people. We're basically well-adjusted people, with certain exceptions. We're basically pretty normal. All right? And so you have to wonder how all these people in our culture who do not have these questions about God resolved, they can be so brilliant and so accomplished and so adjusted in so many areas of life, yet they are strangely inarticulate about things that really matter. And you know what I mean. Quality people, hardworking people, dudes that are so good at whatever it is that they do and so articulate about whatever it is that they are into are like babbling imbeciles about things that really matter. And they're absolutely unable to form thoughts or have discussion about life's meaning or purpose or about God or about how to find Him. And this is a symptom of hopelessness. Okay, this is how a person constructs their reality when they know that they don't know. All right, this is a person that, because they don't have the answers to the important questions, they occupy themselves with the mundane, and they pretend that it's important. success, material acquisition, shoes, whatever. Okay? Distract themselves and distract others from the fact that they're not feeding their soul. And so, it's ironically in the wealthiest nation that has ever been, we live in a culture that's almost entirely without hope. On the other hand, the author of Hebrews says that a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So the hopelessness that is life without God, our inability to put the pieces of life together without answering the most important questions, the author's saying that there's an answer for that. We have a reason for real hope that feeds our soul, and that's the anchor of stability in our lives, and that reason is that we know where we stand with God. So because Christ has dealt with, in a final way, that problem that man has with God, we can approach God confidently and openly. And we can share what we've learned about him freely with other people because we have hope. And because we know that there are answers. We also know that through Christ, not only do we have the ability to hope for the future, like what happens to me when this life ends, but also that through Christ, God is involved in your life in the present. The hope that we have is not just for the distant future, but also for right now. Because it's in the presence of God that Christ, our high priest, is the forerunner, as this passage says. That's what it means, enter within the veil. Presence of God. So Jesus is there constantly mediating between ourselves and God, keeping that line of communication open. We can be in the presence of God even now because of the work of Christ. So the suffering that these people are experiencing in their situation is not evidence of God's disfavor at all. And so notice what he says. It's a hope that's both sure and steadfast. And that's, pretty graphic language. It's like the anchor has these huge talons that grip the seafloor. Right? And they don't let go no matter what the waves and the wind do to try and pull it free. The boat stands firm, sure and steadfast. God is always in the mix. There's always the basis for real hope for a believer in Jesus Christ, regardless of the situation that you find yourselves in. And so for these Hebrews that this book is written to, God certainly allowed suffering to happen. And he will in your life too. He's not going to shield us from that. But he is at work within that situation. So God does not make everything happen, including suffering, but he is at work in those situations for our good. So the scripture teaches that there's nothing that's too difficult for God. There's nothing in your life that Christ didn't die for. There's nothing in your life that he doesn't have the capacity to work for good. We do have real hope. And, maybe you're sitting here thinking that, that all sounds pretty good, but how do we know that this is not just wishful thinking? What do we root this kind of hope in? Well, the author provides our reasons for it. And so we're going to start reading back in verse 13. It says, "For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. And so having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to his heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement and take hold of the hope set before us. All right, so what is the basis for our hope? It's these two things that he mentions, and he calls them here the promise, which is a reference to Genesis 12, and an oath, which is a reference to Genesis 22. And so both of these things are things that God has sworn to Abraham. And so an oath and a promise. And our author is telling us that our hope is anchored in God's word. And so in the ancient world, there are lots of references to oaths and promises, and not only in the Bible, but in other ancient texts. And an oath would be like if you wanted to enter into a contract. So like if you wanted to buy my goat, and I said, okay, the goat's $50, but you don't have the $50, but you will have the $50 by July 30th. All right, and so you say, may God kill me if I don't keep my word. I'll have your $50 by July 30th. And so that's how things went down back in the day. And so you would swear by God or someone greater than yourself that if you don't keep your word, then this superior person would destroy you. And so that was binding in the ancient world. And there are examples all over the Old Testament. And to invoke the name of your God and then not follow through with your word was to disgrace the name of your God. And if you are God, then how do you swear an oath? All right, there's no one greater than you. So in this passage, it tells us that God swore by himself because there's no one greater. And the point is that God has come to Abraham and told him that he would bless him and he'd make him into a great nation. And then through that nation, the whole world is going to get blessed. And God swore to this by who he is, that he would do this. Not that God would do his part if Abraham did his part. Not that God would do this if Abraham cooperated. This thing is unilateral, all right? God is going to bless Abraham. And then in Genesis 22, after many times restating of, that great promise, God comes before Abraham and he swears an oath. And because of the way that Abraham has responded in faith to the promise that God made, God swears on himself that he will fulfill the promise that he made. And so God's made both a promise and an oath to Abraham to bless him and through him to bless the entire world. And it's through that promise to Abraham that Jesus comes into the world. He's the son of Abraham that dies for the sins of the nations and makes access to God available to all people. God swears by himself because there's no one else to swear to. And then he says, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. And again, I think that we have some kind of cool imagery. And so in ancient Israel, when a person committed a crime or even did something by accident that hurt somebody, there's a provision in the law because the injured family would be trying to hunt that person down, right? And so you would run off to a city of refuge. Right, and and they would give you the ancient right of sanctuary, and so you can stay in that place, in that city of refuge, without any worry about the wrath of the clan that you've injured while you're trying to make your defense. And so what this author is saying is that we flee to Jesus Christ in this same way. He is our place of refuge as we lay hold of the hope that's set before us. We live in protective custody, all right, of this city of refuge. And so, God has spoken. God has promised. God has sworn an oath. And God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And God has made the promise to you that you can be completely reconciled to him forever. And the question is, what will you do? All right, will you take him at his word? And your capacity to experience what your soul thirsts for, the things that you really need when all this temporal stuff is swept aside, that would be like peace with God, answers to the important questions in life. That capacity will be determined by your ability to take God at his word. And so the choice is yours. You can have real hope. So let's finish this. We're going to go to verse 10 here, I think. Yeah. For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown towards his name, in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end. All right, it's hope that lasts a lifetime. Okay, God is our anchor. God is our sanctuary. God's our place of refuge. And the author of Hebrews is calling on us to realize, which means to experience within ourselves in a personal way, the love of God and the hope that he has placed in our heart. And, this is not so much along the lines of like knowing doctrine, but of real Christian experience. And how does that happen? Well, he says to be diligent so as to realize. And God wants to, in an experiential way, fill your life with real hope. And we can do that by applying diligence or perseverance. All right, perseverance produces hope. Well, that was too many. One back. Okay. When we stand in our pain, when we stand through the opposition that we know is there, when we trust God and we take God at his word and we act because we know that we can trust God, not necessarily because we feel like acting, we then begin to personally cultivate something very profound between ourselves and God. All right, a real hope, an anchor for the soul that's able to make sense out of our lives. Okay, and it's able to move us forward even in the context of difficult things. But perseverance in what? Okay, what does the author say here? Your work and the love which you have shown towards his name, in having ministered and in still ministering to the saints. It's a pretty interesting little passage. So as we develop diligence, perseverance, what do we direct it towards? And so he's talking about meeting the real physical needs, the spiritual needs, the personal needs of the brothers and sisters around them in this little church that's under this, persecution. But notice what he says, your work and love which you have shown towards his name. Towards his name. Okay, what's he saying? And he's saying that your active steps of faith are to serve who? Who is Christ's body? Okay, he identifies God himself with this. To serve God's people is to serve God himself. And so before Paul came to know Christ, he's out killing Christians. And Jesus met him on the road between Jerusalem and Damascus. And what did Jesus say first to Paul when his name was Saul? Saul, Saul, right? Why are you persecuting me? It's the same thing, God and God's people. And so the way that we accord worth to God, the way that we respond to God in a big way, is that we move toward his people. Okay, we really get involved in meeting the real needs of people, because when we do that, we're stepping right into the line of fire. Okay, it takes a real active faith to step outside of your own little world and into the world of the needs and the concerns of other people. It takes a real active faith to set aside our rights to retaliate and to maintain bitterness and to really forgive. It takes a real active faith to set aside my needs for the moment and really meet the needs of someone else. So Matthew 25, Christ says that as you do to the least of these, you do to me, because he is so identified with his people. All right, so we respond to God by making a difference in one another's lives, and that causes us to fall back on our hope. Why else would we do anything like that, right? I wouldn't. Active steps of faith as we move towards other people, it galvanizes the hope that God gives us as we see God work. This is how you see God work. You see it work in your own life as you minister to other people, and you see it work in their lives. So have you ever had that experience where you just feel like you're kind of overwhelmed? You don't really feel like you have much to give, but then you kind of move towards someone that needs it anyway. All right? And then they start to move forward, and then they find real hope. And you can just see God at work. And then that gives you a sense of real hope, because you can see that what God is doing in someone else is through you. All right, and so it's this kind of dynamic that, in a body of people that do care about one another, it lends like real authenticity to the Christian witness. It's the thing that is the distinctive of the Christian community, is their love for one another. All right, so it isn't just that we say, or, that we read the Bible. It's what other people can see with their eyes about how we interact with one another. All right, so hope is the anchor for our soul. And God wants you to have hope today. And he's calling on us to receive that hope first by receiving the free gift of grace from God, but then by doing something. And that doing something is loving one another.